Welcome to NTS Perspectives, a podcast brought to you by the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, Nanyang Technological University, Singapore. We speak with experts from Asia Pacific and beyond to share their views on pressing NTS issues ranging from climate change, food security, the energy transition, biosecurity, planetary health, and women, peace, and security. Critical minerals are an essential part of the low-carbon energy transition. To achieve net zero emissions, the International Energy Agency has forecasted the demand for critical minerals will need to triple by 2030 and quadruple by 2040. Amid geopolitical competition, there is a growing global tussle for critical minerals, with countries looking to secure and diversify their supply chains. According to the ASEAN IGF Minerals Cooperation Scoping Study on critical minerals supply chains in ASEAN, 4 key mineral reserves are in Southeast Asia. These include nickel, tin, rare earth elements, and bauxite. In this episode, we have with us Dr. Vlado Vivoda, CEO and Director of Strategic Minerals Advisory and Research in Canberra, Australia, and Industry Fellow at the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining Sustainable Minerals Institute at the University of Queensland, Brisbane, Australia. Hi, Dr. Vlado.
Hi, Danielle. How are you?
Great that you can join us today. Your area of interest for research is on critical minerals. So to start with, could you share with us on what are critical minerals and their applications?
Thank you. That's a great question and great to be here to share my insight. So critical minerals are a set of natural resources that are vital for modern economies but face risks of supply disruption, either because they're geologically scarce, geographically concentrated, or are controlled by a small number of producers. So lists of critical minerals vary by country, so no two lists are the same, but typically include lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, rare earth elements, tungsten, vanadium, and several others. And what unites them is their importance to strategic sectors. So applications are broad and cut across many domains. In clean energy, for example, critical minerals underpin the technologies that make decarbonization possible. So from lithium, nickel, and cobalt in rechargeable batteries to rare earth in permanent magnets for wind turbines and electric vehicles. In the defense sector, they're critical for high-performance jet engines and naval propulsion systems, missile guidance, for example. In healthcare, they're found in medical imaging devices and in advanced surgical tools. And in everyday life, we rely on them for smartphones, laptops, and even household appliances for this very technology we're using right now as we're recording. So they're sometimes described as the vitamins and minerals, pardon the pun, of modern economies, are small in volume, but really essential for the functioning of larger systems.
Usually, we're not aware it's used in all our everyday materials and digital technologies, and even in healthcare, that's interesting. Why are critical minerals important to development and the global cooperation in the low-carbon energy transition?
So the energy transition is in many ways a materials transition. So moving away from fossil fuels to electrification means moving from hydrocarbons to minerals. So a conventional car needs around 30 kilograms of minerals, whereas an electric vehicle requires over 200 kilograms. So and that's also spread across probably about 6 times as many mineral types. So a gas power plant requires relatively little mineral input once built, but a wind farm needs large quantities of copper, manganese, rare earths, and some other inputs. So this has 2 implications. The first one is that the pace of the energy transition depends on securing reliable, affordable supplies of these minerals. And secondly, because no country has all the resources it needs, cooperation becomes essential. So the risks of resource nationalism, export bans, weaponization of supply chains, and some evidence that we've been seeing in recent months, and we've seen historically with oil and gas, and now increasingly with minerals. What this means is that collective approaches are needed. Developmentally, resource-rich states also face a once-in-a-generation opportunity to turn that mineral endowment into industrial and economic upgrading. But whether this is realized depends on governance, depends on investment, and depends on cooperation, regional and more global.
Talking about, you mentioned also in recent years, there's been a lot of geopolitical competition between the US and China, and it has accelerated ever since the second Trump administration. So, how has this impacted the critical minerals industry?
Geopolitical competition is certainly reshaping critical mineral supply chains in profound ways, no doubt about that. During the first Trump administration, there was already an emphasis on reducing dependence on China. This has not changed during Biden administration either. And in fact, there's been a lot of consistency in America's critical minerals strategy. But in the second Trump administration, that effort has intensified and become more progressive approach on securing critical mineral supply chain. So the US is strengthening some of its alliances with some of its allies to co-invest in mining and processing projects. And at the same time, we are seeing a lot of restrictions on trade and investment on Chinese companies specifically, which have kind of happened in a lot of countries, not just in the US. So China, for its part, has responded by tightening its grip on critical minerals where it has some domination. We had first those export controls on gallium and germanium in 2023 as an early signal of that, followed by restrictions on graphite in 2024. And a few other kind of policy measures on various other critical minerals that have been taken. But these measures have created volatility, price spikes, and a lot of uncertainty for downstream industries, such as electric vehicles and the semiconductors. And for companies, this has meant accelerating diversification strategies away from China and de-risking from China, with more projects being developed in Australia, some Southeast Asia, Africa, Latin America. So for ASEAN countries, it has created an amazing opportunity for attracting investment into new projects and processing capacity, but at the same time risk, as they are caught between competing pressures from Washington and Beijing.
What are some of the impacts of the geopolitical competition and on critical minerals, and how would this impact national security concerns?
Well, in terms of national security, when you're looking at critical minerals and security concerns, the best way to approach it is from that kind of trilemma perspective, what I call a trilemma perspective, where security is one part of the trilemma. The other two are economics and sustainability. And you are always aiming to achieve all three to meet that trilemma, right? But often there are tensions within security, between different countries or blocs or so on, and between different parts of the trilemma, so security versus cost or sustainability versus security. So it will vary in terms from country to country depending on both their geological endowment, approaches to critical minerals, and their relationship with other states. It will vary from country to country. It will shift as international alignment and as connections with other countries shift and as the geopolitics shift with time, those kinds of security implications of this will shift too. We're certainly having a lot of critical mineral agreements and partnerships emerging. Now, I've got a paper coming up that is going to look into that in some detail. And the answer is, with these critical mineral agreements, there's a lot of ambiguity around them. Some of them are very clear and straightforward what they're about, but a lot of them there's a lot of ambiguity and openness to interpretation and how these critical mineral agreements and partnerships move forward. Are they just sort of, these unilateral, bilateral agreements are moving forward and showing these new partnerships between countries? Perhaps, but they certainly allow for a lot of space for maneuver, right, in terms of how they're moved forward in a lot of instances.
In terms of Australia. What has been some of maybe the recent developments in terms of critical mineral partnerships with other countries?
Australia's been quite active. We first have the overall defense partnerships, and those would include possibly some cooperation with critical minerals. This is with under the AUKUS umbrella and so on and so forth, and also under the umbrella of the Mineral Security Partnership, which is a collection of many Western countries in Japan and South Korea and India and several others on responsible critical mineral supply chain. So I think Australia is quite active there in this space where it's providing that support in creating more resilient and diversified critical mineral supply chains in the future, ensuring that supply chain remains reliable. I think Australia plays a very important role there. I think Australia recognizes that role as well and is ensuring that it remains perceived as that secure supplier and a partner for other countries.
You've written about the rising importance of critical minerals in Southeast Asia in an RSIS commentary previously published. What role can ASEAN play in strategic supply chains for critical minerals?
ASEAN's role is both as a producer and a potential processing hub. The region I've outlined in the RSIS commentary and in a paper that just got accepted and will be published in Mineral Economics soon with a couple of colleagues from Norway. ASEAN is really rich in resources. Indonesia is the world's largest nickel supplier. It's got other resources too, like cobalt and tin and so forth. Philippines is a major nickel supplier as well, cobalt, copper. Myanmar has significant rare earth and tin deposits. Vietnam has enormous size of tungsten and rare earths as well. And even Laos and Cambodia are being increasingly explored. So there's a lot of real potential there in ASEAN. But beyond geology, ASEAN is strategically located between China, India, Japan and Australia, making it a natural crossroads for supply chain. And Singapore, I don't need to stress how important Singapore is for the global financial system and as that kind of hub. So I think there's a lot of potential there for ASEAN, not just to be primarily an exporter of raw materials, but actually moving up the value chain into refining, processing, manufacturing, but also providing that kind of financial center for that future kind of critical mineral system that's emerging. This latter path is perhaps more difficult, but potentially also more rewarding, as it would allow the region to capture greater economic value, create more skilled jobs, and help the world reduce that vulnerability to price swings, and help the rest of the world diversify the supply chains away from China as well. So with that demand for de-risking from China, ASEAN has a great opportunity to position itself as a credible alternative in those broader supply chains.
And what are some of the areas that ASEAN can grow in terms of its capacity on processing critical minerals?
The biggest gap is midstream capacity, refining really and separation. So China dominates this space, handling more than 60% of lithium refining and more than 80% of rare earth separation. So ASEAN countries, Indonesia is already moving up into nickel refining. However, Indonesian nickel refining is largely owned by Chinese firms, so that kind of goes a little bit against the whole purpose of it. But moving on beyond Indonesia, Vietnam is a good example. It has world-class tungsten processing facilities, and it also has great ambitions for rare earth separation. So Malaysia has past experience in rare earth processing and could further develop the capacity. Thailand's there too. The challenges here really are you could say threefold. One would be technology. Processing is technically complex and both environmental and environmentally sensitive. So it's not just technology as the challenge, it's the capital that's needed and environmental standards that need to be implemented. So to succeed in a way, ASEAN states would need kind of greater investment in research and development, in skills and infrastructure, as well as governance systems across the region to ensure that environmental safeguards are met. So if done well, ASEAN could really build niche processing capacities, in collaboration with the likes of Australia that complement upstream mining and tie into and develop regional value chains.
How can regional coordination and cooperation help to advance Southeast Asia's role in critical minerals? You've mentioned that developing a regional framework, perhaps similar to the EU's Critical Raw Minerals Act, would be a way forward.
Firstly, just going back to that first question, I think coordination overall matters a lot because without it, countries risk undercutting each other. Sort of a race to the bottom. We need some coordination, particularly the more of it, the better. Otherwise, we'll have countries competing in this kind of what you call a race to the bottom, competing on tax break, really lax regulations. That doesn't do good on that kind of ESG kind of considerations in the long term. I think a regional framework could harmonize standards. It could also pool bargaining power with investors, and it could coordinate infrastructure development across the region so that the countries are not doing the same thing and wasting those limited resources. But this would also give ASEAN a stronger collective voice in global negotiations, whether it be with China, with the United States, or the European Union. Going back to your second question on the Critical Raw Materials Act, the European Union, CRMA, offers a very useful model. So the Critical Raw Materials Act set clear quantitative targets. So for example, by 2030, at least 10% of EU demand to be met by domestic extraction, 40% by processing, and 15% by recycling. So they've got clear targets. The Act also streamlines permitting for strategic projects and supports investment. So importantly, it links critical minerals policy to broader industrial strategy, which helps ensure and bring in alignment across different sectors. So I think there's lessons to be heeded here for ASEAN. We're adapting this model. Of course, ASEAN is different than the European Union, very different, socially, culturally, politically, economically. Considering this model and adapting it for its own intents and purposes and tailoring it could provide both direction and credibility and would potentially provide a signal to investors that the region is serious about building secure and sustainable supply chains.
And you mentioned responsible critical minerals. You could elaborate further on this aspect as well.
Social and environmental impact of mining and critical mineral supply chains are real and cannot be ignored. Mining often involves deforestation, heavy water use, pollution, tailings management, which is the storage of mine waste. And we had a paper on this recently on the geopolitical aspect of this is a particular concern, as failures can cause catastrophic damage to communities and ecosystems. We've had that happen in Brazil the past decade a couple of times. Tailing collapses. We've had it happen in the region as well, and we had it happen in Oktedi over in Papua New Guinea. So socially, at the same time, projects can displace communities. They can affect indigenous land rights, and they can create tensions around sharing of benefits. For instance, in Myanmar, which is in ASEAN, rare earth mining in Kachin state up in the north has left severe environmental scars. Just unregulated, uncontrolled, a bit of the kind of Wild West approach to rare earth mining. In Indonesia, nickel mining has raised concerns about mangrove destruction and marine pollution. Same applies for nickel processing that's controlled mainly by Chinese entities. So these issues undermine community trust. They also negatively affect the environment, and they can provoke resistance to projects. In some respect, a sustainable pathway requires integrating environmental safeguards and social responsibility from the start, mining across the supply chain of critical minerals. So not just from exploration and extraction, but through processing and moving on into downstream, into actual manufacturing. And this includes, free, prior, and informed consent for affected communities, strong rehabilitation and closure plans or after mining or critical mineral processing has taken place, and benefit sharing mechanisms that ensure local populations see tangible gains. Mining and critical minerals can enable the energy transition, but if it's done poorly, it risks reproducing a lot of the injustices caused by past extractivism. So it's just important to be careful of how we mine, how we engage critical mineral supply chain, so it's done responsibly. And by responsible supply chains, the Mineral Security Partnership, was formed as this was one of its key tenets, was to support the development of supply chains based on traceability and social and environmental responsibility as much as possible. Considering what are the needs and inputs from the local communities where mining takes place, and making it just, not just kicking people off their lands, but actually implementing leading practice standards that leading mining companies around the world implement in their own, the way they approach projects. So genuinely approaching the communities and the local environment in a way in which adequately immerse their livelihoods will not be negatively affected. They will be relocated based on what their needs are in a just and equitable way, not just kicked off their lands. Their livelihoods will not be threatened. Local environment, of course, mining affects the ecosystem, but mine closure plans can be put in place that ensure that this environment is brought back to pre-mining land use as much as possible, or to an agreed land use amongst all the stakeholders, including the local government, the national governments, local governments, and local communities, in which that ecosystem is recreated post-mining, or in a way in which the communities are given empowerment through alternative ways in which communities can grow. What is the community goal? If mining is to take place, what can the proponent of the project do to empower that community to grow? Can it invest in schools? Can it invest in roads? Can it invest in healthcare? Can it invest in sporting facilities? And there are plentiful examples around the world where these types of projects have been developed successfully and with full support from the local community. So these are just some of the examples of how mining, can be done in a way in which, of course, it's a destructive activity on the ecosystem, but it's still a way to do mining right. We still need, if people still want to use their mobile phones and drive Teslas and so on, that comes from somewhere. So how can we ensure that the whole supply chain is sustainable in a way in which it protects the environment as much as possible and it doesn't negatively affect communities and stakeholders along the way? I think this is where a lot of that kind of traceability and provenance standards are coming into place, like the European Union's battery passport regulation that from, I think, 2026 or 27, electric vehicle battery or large-scale battery that's sold into the European Union will need to have a passport. Our supply chain will need to be traced to ensure that human rights abuses, child labor, and similar kind of things don't happen along the way, along the supply chain. So I think this is where we're heading to, in a way, where we actually do take greater responsibility for a society and environment while acknowledging that mining and critical mineral supply chains are essential in order to maintain our lifestyles.
Could you share more on the importance and application of ESG standards for critical minerals?
ESG, environmental social governance standards are becoming really a cornerstone of the industry and of responsible, industry participants. And so automakers like Tesla, Volkswagen, Toyota, and governments, European Union, United States, Australia, are increasingly requiring traceability and responsible sourcing. So investors are also demanding it more. Reputational and regulatory risks are growing as well. So we have standards, for example, the initiative consolidating standards, mining industry standards are emerging. The Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, they provide these assurance reports from mine sites. They answer a whole bunch of series of questions related to environmental, social, and governance issues on a mine site or specific project and give independent assurance for it that it does tick all the boxes. And increasingly investors are looking at that. Are your operations sustainable? What are you up to, really? We want to shine the light on the entire supply chain before we actually commit to supporting this type of operation. So these types of standards and assurance systems are becoming increasingly prevalent. For example, the battery passport regulation in the EU and Global Battery Alliance's battery passport as well are further examples of these efforts to create accountability and transparency across the supply chain. These mechanisms and these standards are not perfect, but I think that they are steps towards ensuring that the minerals are, powering the energy transition and other needs of modern lifestyles are not sourced at the expense of human rights or ecosystems. Therefore, I think ESG is not just about ethics, but about maintaining market access and competitiveness.
Dr. Vlado, from your fieldwork research, what are some of the challenges that are facing the critical minerals industry today, and what do you think is the way forward?
There are three key challenges that I could think of immediately. One would be the issue of governance capacity. This has always been an issue. It's not something new, but really something that needs to be kind of looked at in a bit more detail on how things can be improved. So many resource-rich states struggle with regulatory oversight, where licensing, monitoring, and enforcement often lag behind the rapid pace of investment and mining and activities, where this opens space for corruption, environmental violations, and community grievances. So that's one challenge. Another challenge is the community trust. So the legacies of extractive industries weigh really heavily here. A lot of communities globally are skeptical of promises of jobs and development. So it's so important to build trust, but it requires genuine engagement and long-term partnerships, and not just one-off consultations and box-ticking exercises, but actual relationships. And the third challenge would be the question of market volatility and uncertainty, where prices for lithium, nickel, cobalt, and other critical minerals can swing dramatically within months, as we've seen with lithium and nickel in recent years. This makes it extremely difficult for governments to plan revenues and for companies to invest with confidence. And in response, we're seeing a lot more strategic intervention by government in partnership with companies in order to implement strategies that safeguard, that give a bit more surety and security to investors, to companies to operate and reduce risks, such as that, for example, public-private partnerships that are emerging, such as between the United States Department of Defense and MP Materials, the rare earths group, where the Pentagon have agreed to a price floor for rare earths, which gives an investor and a mining company gives some surety in times of market volatility, where the largest supplier is simply dropping the price, affecting the market, getting the price so low that it beats out all the other competitors out of the market. So in order to create a diversified market, there needs to be some sort of strategic intervention from governments, and we're seeing that emerge increasingly in some countries, including the United States and increasingly Australia and so on. So we're seeing that kind of there's challenges and responses that are kind of covered, but these challenges really highlight that critical minerals are not just a technical or economic issue, but they're deeply social and political. So without addressing that governance, trust, and stability, the industry potentially risks failing to deliver on its promise of powering an energy transition.
Thank you so much for your insights and for speaking with us on NTS Perspectives, Dr. Vlado.
You're very welcome, Danielle. Very happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
You've been listening to NTS Perspectives, brought to you by the Center for Non-Traditional Security Studies at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. And to our listeners, you can follow us for future episodes on RSIS Spotify and YouTube channels, and connect with us via RSIS LinkedIn, IG, and Facebook platforms. For more information on what we do at the NTS Center, you can visit our website at rsis.edu.sg/research/NTS-Center. Thanks for tuning in.